but critically we're living in a different world now. And the pressures on our environment have changed dramatically in our birding lifetimes. And we have grave concerns that we need to move with the times.
Welcome to Political Sandbox by Chamber, and today we've got a special episode focusing on the woodcock and species conservation. I'm Olivia Blake and I'm the Member for Parliament for Sheffield Hallam and the former Shadow Climate Change Minister and Nature Minister. I am really pleased to be talking about the amazing woodcock today and my passions for nature restoration and the importance of both the climate and nature emergency and how they're both intertwined. In my constituency, it reaches right out into the Peak District, so I'm really proud to represent some of our most beautiful landscapes, but they have been under threat. So I've been campaigning alongside many people on different issues affecting species across Britain, especially as a species champion for the hen harrier, but also lots of different other birds and fantastic species that are at risk at the moment. I'm really pleased to be joined today by Chris Packham, the TV presenter and author, and Lord John Randall, peer for Uxbridge. And today we're going to have a really good conversation about the woodcock. So if you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Yes, Olivia, thank you for the invitation to come along. So I'm Chris Packham, I'm a broadcaster and a keen and avid birder, along with John, and we've already been sharing photographs of birds on our phones before we started this morning. So we're both avid ornithologists and great advocates for the woodcock, which is a species of wader, as you know, which is in critical decline in the UK as a breeding species. So we've seen significant measured declines in recent times and in our lifetimes, which has been very disappointing. And yet it's a bird which is still shot every year. About 160,000 woodcock are still shot in the UK every year. So we're seeking reform to some of the legislation to hopefully protect our woodcock.
Yeah, and as Chris said, I'm John Randall. I'd like to think principally a birder and conservationist, and incidentally, I'm also a former MP for Uxbridge and now a peer of the realm. Although Lord Randall of Uxbridge makes me sound like a pub, so I don't dwell on that too much. I've been passionate about wildlife and conservation ever since I was a kid, and now I've got an opportunity to use whatever influence I can on this. And as Chris said, the woodcock is actually a very good example, which we'll probably talk about. Actually, we're not asking for the earth on woodcock conservation, although we would probably like that. All we're looking for is a reduction in the shooting season. Why anybody wants to shoot a woodcock, I have no idea. And I have no idea, I guess they're quite difficult to shoot actually, maybe that's the appeal of them.
I think it is the appeal. So one of the UK periodicals, which is quite well supported, well read, has a club called the Woodcock Club. And to be a member of the Woodcock Club, you have to have a double-barreled shotgun or an under-and-over shotgun and shoot 2 woodcock with the 2 cartridges which are in it at that point. So the idea being that 2 of the birds are flushed and you shoot both of them in one go. We flush woodcock when we're out in the woods in the wintertime, and they dart away between the trees. So shooting them is indeed difficult, and I think it's that leads to this sort of cachet, if you like, of shooting woodcock. Although I think it's important to say, John, at this point that actually significant numbers of the shooting fraternity have stopped shooting woodcock, have taken shooting's own guidance and have not been shooting them until December, or at least until they feel that there are good numbers of woodcock in the UK. And I suppose for the benefit of our viewers, we ought to also say that whilst I started by mentioning the breeding population of woodcock, millions of woodcock migrate to the UK every winter, arriving from Scandinavia, Northern Europe and Russia. And so what we're seeking is for a reduction in shooting up until those migrants arrive. And that, on the surface of it, would protect our resident breeding woodcock here. And, as I was intimating, quite a significant proportion of the shooting industry have stopped shooting, or they will only shoot when there are significant numbers. But we're still concerned that a large enough number of woodcock, the 160,000 that I mentioned, might be having a negative impact on our resident breeding population of a red listed wader whose population is declining in the midst of a biodiversity crisis.
And do we know what the true impact is on breeding numbers of the woodcock, or is that something that we're not quite sure of? How rapid is that decline?
Well, again, science. We like to have the science so that we can make best informed decisions. And I think that what we should be doing alongside any changes in this regulation is monitoring the effects of it. Quite obviously, a few years ago we asked for a moratorium on shooting woodcock, golden plover, and snipe. Those other species are also in decline. So that we could see what impact shooting was having on these species. But at that point, the shooting fraternity said, no, we don't want a moratorium. If we take them off of the game list, if you like, then we'll never get them back on again. Well, maybe that would have been the right thing had we decided that shooting was having a negative impact on their population. But I think it's also worth saying, and again, I'm not coming to the defence of the shooting industry here, but I just want to be honest about everything, and that is that the reasons that the woodcock have been declining in the UK are not solely down to shooting. There are other, perhaps far more significant factors. So that would be loss of habitat, of course, changes in agricultural and forestry practices, and also the enormous number of deer that we have in the UK, which are impacting on our woodlands to the deficit of not just woodcock, but many other species of bird and insect and so on and so forth too. So there are other factors involved, but our point, I think, is that when you've got all of those factors, why carry on shooting them when they're in enough trouble anyway? Would that be?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And first of all, I'd like to echo what you said, Chris, about there are some enlightened members of the shooting fraternity. We certainly don't want to paint them all as evil or anything like that. I've got quite a lot of you expect in the House of Lords who enjoy shooting. And I don't want to stop that. But this is ridiculous, actually, because the reason I put a question in to DEFRA saying whether they will restrict the shooting season. And the answer came back, and the shooting fraternity came back saying, we haven't got actually enough evidence to make a difference. Well, I would have thought patently shooting something, the numbers, is going to reduce them. So I can't quite follow that argument. The other thing I was going to say about woodcock, Olivia, I'm not sure how up in woodcock you are, but what I find fascinating, so the breeding population you tend to see in woodland and so forth, and you flush them, or if you go at dusk, they have this thing called roding. They fly along making this little clicking noise. It's fantastic. But the migrants can turn up anywhere. And they very often turn up in London because they're flying in, and you'll see reports of one by Waterloo Bridge, or they're exhausted, and normally they get away. I found in my garden, if you remember the Beast from the East a few years ago, I have a trail cam in my garden, and I moved it for some reason from away from where the badgers and the foxes and so forth are. It's not a big garden, it's suburban, and I moved it somewhere else. I wanted to see what was happening, whether the foxes were coming up this path. Blow me, when I look at it, there's a woodcock landed in front of the camera for, I don't know how long it was there for. It wasn't on the next picture, so it probably just had a little rest in Uxbridge and moved on. But that's what's so fascinating about all these things. And to think that poor little bird's life could be ended after it's made that journey upsets me. But as I said, it's we've got to the stage where we're critical populations, and it's not necessarily shooting that's decreasing them, but it can't be helping when you're down to few numbers.
Yeah. So we're asking for that to be understood. That's the bottom line, isn't it? We want to understand what impact shooting has on these birds. And at the moment, what we're asking for, and I should add that our petition that we have running, which has currently more than 50,000 signatures, nudging 60, and it still has a period to run, so we're hoping that it will reach its total of 100,000 to precipitate a potential debate, is within the power of the Secretary of State to grant immediately. This wouldn't require legislative change. It would simply require a decision to be made and then that could change instantaneously. So this really should be low-hanging fruit for us, you know. We're working with a much-loved bird. You can tell from John and I's enthusiasm, you know, that all birds are equal, but some birds are more equal than others.
I think that's spot on.
And the woodcock is one of those birds. It's much loved by the ornithological community, the birding community, and of course, you know, many members of the shooting community too. So seeking to protect it through any means possible at this critical point, you know, is what we wish to do. And given that it could be done just like that, it should happen.
So I think politically, as Chris has said, for you and my benefit, this is something that we don't have to wait for a parliamentary time. I think it possibly would be what you and I know as a statutory instrument, but they can go through on a wet Wednesday afternoon when there's not much else going on in a committee room. I don't think there would be a huge amount of opposition to it, to be perfectly honest. There'd be a few people would see this as somehow, as Chris said, you know, the thin end of the wedge. What next? But actually, it's something I believe, and I'm pushing on. I won't say it's pushing an open door, but I don't think it's a locked door.
I mean, it sounds like the campaign has been gaining quite a lot of momentum, and you've already got quite a lot of signatures. What else could people be doing to support the woodcock? And are you encouraging people to share this with their friends and families? And I guess a final question really from me would be, what's unique about the woodcock and how is it different from other waders in the UK?
God, you've opened a can of worms. Worms being the food of the woodcock, actually. So they have a long probing bill, which they are what we call a woodland wader. Most wading birds, people think of them as birds of estuary and shoreline, yeah. But these are a woodland wader. Their plumage is the complete opposite of my attire today. They are a rich, vermiculate mix of browns and blacks. Their camouflage is unrivaled by perhaps anything in the UK other than the nightjar. And they rest on the ground perfectly still, and so convinced of their camouflage are they that you virtually have to tread on them before they flush, because they're sat there thinking, nothing can see me. And in terms of seeing themselves, what's unusual is that their eyes are right on the sides of their head here, which means that although they can't see directly in front of their beak or directly behind them, they have a fantastic field of vision around them, again, to look out for potential predators. Resting as they are on the ground, they are obviously vulnerable to foxes and badgers and any other ground predators that might be there. But John, I'm going to ask you a question, because the woodcock also is a bird of legend and mystery. And it's lore and not science and it's said that a female woodcock, once the young have hatched, small fluffy birds like this, will, if they are threatened, hold one at a time between her legs and fly them to safety. So it being that they're on the woodland floor, a predator's approaching or some threat, and she will rest over the top of the chick, close her legs on the chick like that, and then fly and drop the chick a safe distance away. Now, we've known that story all our lives. I've never seen it.
I've never seen it.
But what do you think, John? Do you believe that might happen?
I think it's perfectly possible. I would imagine somebody at some stage saw this and reported it, and it's gone round. You'd have to be incredibly lucky to see something like that. But you know, and we know all the marvellous things that birds and all wildlife get up to. A few months ago, I was watching sand grouse, and they go and get water, and they put it on their chests to go and fly considerable distances to give their chicks water. And you could see them with it. I mean, so that's just but what birds do, it's just fantastic. The more you know. The American woodcock, of course, does this amazing dance, doesn't it? It sort of does if you have a moment free, Olivia, you Google American woodcock dancing, and you will see something that is pretty impressive.
If I had any of those skills myself, I'd demonstrate it now. I mean, basically, they sort of do an Egyptian type dance as they move through the environment, a bit like the way chameleons wobble as they're moving. So it looks as if they're leaves blowing in the wind. They're trying to merge into the background. And with their incredible camouflage, when they're moving like this through the undergrowth, they're difficult to see. But those clips that you might see on social media are when they are trying to do it on tarmac or something, and then they look pretty weird. But I think one thing to add, Olivia, is that obviously Wild Justice, the group that I'm representing this morning, Mark Avery, Ruth Tingay, and myself, have been asking for various reforms when it comes to shooting, because we feel that shooting hasn't been properly regulated for some time, and that critically we're living in a different world now, and the pressures on our environment have changed dramatically in our birding lifetimes, and we have grave concerns that we need to move with the times. So obviously we've worked hard to try and see and introduce the cessation of lead shot being used. We know it kills 100,000 birds through accidental ingestion in the UK. In many parts of the world, many countries, lead shot has been banned. It hasn't seemingly impacted negatively on the shooting industry, but it's certainly benefited the birds. So we've been campaigning about that. We've sought reform to the general licences. General licences being a licence which is given generally, therefore not applied to, so that we're trying to prevent the unnecessary killing of birds in the environment. And our core purpose, if you like, is to explore the legislation which is in place, see if it's fit for purpose. It might be that the legislation needs changing, or if not, see if it's being properly implemented or not. So we're basically gently pushing to, nudge unsustainable and sometimes, as you'll know as a champion of the hen harrier, illegal shooting, i.e. the persecution of our raptors, in the right direction. Because we feel that it's time for, like everything else, this is a time where we need to change our habits to adapt to a very, a world which is in a flux of change, potentially very difficult changes. So we just feel that shooting needs to up its game and change its thinking and practices so that they're more compatible with contemporary conservation, basically.
And we're losing species all the time, aren't we, in the UK? And I think I read that the UK is actually the most nature-depleted country in Europe, which is a shocking...
The world, one of the most
in the world
yeah,
as well, which is obviously very depressing. And I guess for me, I'm very interested in how the climate and nature intertwine. And I wonder, in terms of population here, obviously this petition is aimed at narrowing the season to protect birds that make their home here. But how much of the percentage of birds of the woodcock that are here are actually that home staying here for the whole year, and how many are migratory?
Yeah, no. So we have a much smaller population than the migrants that arrive, and we should say again that woodcock are a species which exists in the UK from Ireland all the way around, Scandinavia, Russia. They're a successful species of birds. There are indications that they're equally declining in other parts of their range. But what we are very lucky in the UK is that we have an enormous repository of very talented and able amateur bird watchers who complete a plethora of surveys. So I would argue that when it comes to populations of wildlife, we probably have our finger more firmly on the pulse than anywhere else in the world. We know our backyard really well, don't we?
What's quite interesting, Olivia, is in the last few years, actually it's with the advent of phones and everything else, iPhones, whatever, whereas before it would be these dedicated amateurs going out and surveying sites and everything else. There's a lot more citizen science out there now where people can record what they've seen or whatever, and that's being accumulated. Even I haven't got round to it. A lot of my mates have put their old bird list, because that's what we do. We make lists of how many we saw and everything else, and put it on. You can do it retrospectively on various sites. When I look through my notebooks, there's another bird which is in real trouble in the UK, which is the turtle dove. And I look at my notes, as I said, I'm in Middlesex, in West London, and probably now, let me see, it's probably about 40 years ago, I'd be seeing 20 on my walk round the gravel pits.
Locally.
Literally, in my local patch. And now it's a rarity. I don't know when the last ones were seen in the London area. There may be the odd one coming through, but that's what worries me. But as Chris said, we have so much knowledge. Some of it's very depressing. I can be a bit more positive about some other species. Over my garden, I've got red kites, buzzards, ravens, which I never... Peregrine breeds on Hillingdon Hospital, for heaven's sake, and they come over the garden.
Yeah.
And when we were out, we'd have to go a long, long way to see a peregrine.
Yeah.
They're actually probably out the window because they actually come onto Parliament. Peregrines.
Amazing. And I think, I'm the same. I kind of look out my window and hope to see something exciting, and I was so excited to see some swifts taking root in my neighbour's property this year. But I think more and more people are valuing how precious our nature is and how we should be protecting it. And you're absolutely right about apps and things like that helping. So I guess, what more can people do to help protect our great British species and help with this campaign?
We do the groundwork. We go out, and John's got his notebooks and filling in his app. We all do that. The citizen scientists that you mentioned are out there doing it too. So we've got the data. We now have to make that data count, and we need to make it account at a critical time. Because yes, there have been some species which have recovered, but the general trend, as you've pointed out, is that we are living in one of the most nature-depleted collections of nations in the world. It's really scary that our own backyard falls into that category when there's so much passion in the UK. Yeah. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, just as an indicator, has more than 1 million members. But there's a huge amount of passion for birds and wildlife here. But that passion needs to be transformed into action, which is why we initiate petitions like the Wild Justice Petition, because people can very easily sign it. So they can become activists without gluing themselves to anything or blocking a road. They can sign that petition to support it. And I think that, as you both know, as formerly elected representative and currently an elected representative, your constituents can come to you and say, I have grave concerns about this. Will you please, help us do something about it? And I think a growing number of MPs, well, all MPs are aware of climate crisis and biodiversity crisis, but a growing number of MPs like yourself have had the time to understand that those impacts can be measured locally, like John's turtle doves, like the hen harriers that should be on the moors near where your constituents live. And therefore, we want them back because we can have them back. And so we will reach out through a peaceful democratic process with our elected representatives and say, help us. All we want to do here is change the length of the shooting season. It's not a big ask.
And the other thing I'd say, I'm delighted, and a lot of colleagues in not just in Westminster but elsewhere now are talking about the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis in the same vein. I'm always concerned that we go on about climate. Of course we do. It's an incredible problem for the world. But we've got to get that message out to the people on the street that it's not just the climate. It is biodiversity. And actually, funnily enough, I think that resonates even more, although some of the extreme weather we've been having, I think, has done a good job on making people aware. And I'll give you an example. I was Prime Minister Theresa May's Environment Advisor in number 10. And we were persuading her about the climate change, the climate crisis, everything else. And she said to me, John, actually, you're right. When I've been walking in Switzerland, I've noticed, because she goes there apparently regularly, she said, I've noticed the glacier is getting smaller. So you just put it in people's mind. Then I have to say, my best moment of all in number 10 is when she told me she'd seen a hoopoe. She knew what it was, and I thought,
that's a great story.
I've converted her. She may have already been there, but I just thought that was great. Here you are, the Prime Minister talking to me. It's easy when Chris and I talk about birds and everything else we do, but there was the Prime Minister of the UK getting excited.
Hey, that's a dream for us, isn't it? When Prime Ministers are getting excited about hoopoes.
But do you know, just out of interest,
has Rishi got binoculars?
I'll get him some.
You need to get Rishi some binoculars.
I'll tell you something. I don't know whether I think he was the Prime Minister back in. I think it was not Baldwin, but one of them was a keen birder. It was
Chamberlain.
Chamberlain.
Yeah.
And he wrote a letter to the Times.
Yes.
just before the Second World War, saying he'd seen a grey wagtail at St James's Park and said, and I mean it's a grey wagtail, not a pied wagtail, I know what I'm talking about.
He put up bird boxes in
Yeah.
number 10,
Yeah.
and he would take his sort of, under the terrible, pressures of that early stages of the war, he would go to the park and go birding, and that's how he found his respite and solace.
And that's what I found over the years. I'm sure you have.
Yeah.
But that's what it does. So that's another thing to get people involved in. It's actually, we've had some pretty rubbish times. We've still got a few. We had lockdowns. Lockdown, I was lucky. I could walk about, I could see, I found things that I didn't even know existed down the road. A brown hair streak, literally, down the road from me. This is a butterfly, by the way.
Special.
Special. That just makes me feel better the whole time. Even now, if it's being a bit grim in the House of Parliament, I can walk round St James's Park.
I do exactly the same thing, and I think it's great having access to nature and those small pockets of nature, even in cities, just to be able to. We know the research about how it's good for your mental health, connecting with nature, and just being in woodland a couple of hours a week can really help.
Sewage works are good too, but that's serious birding.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, it is serious birding, especially in the winter. Good for waders. But let's not get onto sewage because there's another whole.
That's a
whole program.
Oh no!
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we've got a book in the making there. Prime Ministers and their favourite birds.
Yeah. John's got a task. He's got to get Rishi some binoculars.
Get Rishi those binoculars. I'm sure it's on his wish list already. But I'd just like to say thank you for explaining more about the Woodcock and the petition. I'm hoping that the government will listen and that minister will get that statutory instrument in to shorten the period. But I'd just like to say a massive thank you to you both, Chris and John. You're obviously very passionate about this. And I think everyone will understand why it's so important that they back this petition.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it immensely.